If you recall, yesterday on Daf Chavam Beis, we discussed the machlokas between Rabbi Nassan and Rabbi Yossi. And that has to do with the pasuk of Sevaru H B'Chomoch Fotzeichen. And it comes up in our sugya because if Rabbi Shmuel in the Brisa derives from this pasuk of Sevaru H B'Chomoch Fotzeichen that we don't override the Shabbos for the sake of Misas Sreifa, then apparently there was a Havamina that if not for the pasuk of Sevaru H B'Chomoch Fotzeichen, we would have assumed that the mitzvah of Sreifa, in the case of Misas Bezin, would override the Shabbos. And that would be based on Esei Docha Losase, even in a Losa Sheyesh Bo Kares, which would have obvious implications as far as Achos Ishto is concerned. However, the Gemara objects and says that the pasuk of Sevaro Eish B'Chomosh V'Seichen is not superfluous. It's very much needed. And what do we need it for? And that depends on this machlokas between Rabbi Nassan and Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Nassan is of the opinion that Lechalek Yotzes, which means that Lo Sevaro Eish is one of the 39 malachas, but the Torah went out of its way to separate it, to teach us the halach of Chiluk malachas, which we'll discuss in this. On the other hand, Rabbi Yossi says that the Torah downgraded Lo Sevaro Havara, taking it out of the bag of malachos, and it's a separate lot. Now, what I'd like to do is read through a piece here in the Yalkut Bi'urim on page Memtes. It's on the left column. And he quotes, first of all, the fact that Rabbi Nassan, who says Havar L'chalik Yotzes, is a shita that's quoted in many, many sugyas and shas. And he says that Havara Yotza L'lamichim Asa Kama Malachas Galim Achas. He violated a number of different malachos with one forgetfulness. Then Chiluk Malachos Mechalik Es Hachatos V'Chayiv Al Kol Malachim Malach. So the pasuk of Sevaru is teaching me that he's going to be chayiv multiple chatos for violating multiple malachos. So if he does lisha and then another lisha, he only brings one chatos because he violated the same isa twice. And that malach is like dam and dam, chelev and chelev, behalim achas, he only brings one chatos. But in an event that he violated two different chatos, he did lisha and afiyah behalim achas, then he brings two chatos. And that Rabbi Nassan bases on the fact that the Torah added lo sevaro eish b'chomosh v'seichen. Yotza avara k'dei lamdenu sheskiv skila v'kares heim af al malacha achas bilvad. There's a Rashi here in Masechet Yevamot that seems to indicate that the reason why, according to the Shita Rabbi Nassan, the Torah went out of its way to prohibit Havara Shabbos is to teach us that Havara is a malacha, and it generates a chiyuv kares, a chiyuv misa with a basra, and a chiyuv chatos in the case of a shogeg. Now, the implication of Rashi was that maybe Havara is not a malacha, although Havara is has a very profound impact on nature, on the world of creation, but nevertheless it's a negative, destructive kind of impact. Maybe that's not called a malacha. And that's Rashi. The Gemara in Shabbos asks the question, Chiluk malachos minola, from whence do we derive that if you do two malachos and helimachos, you bring two chatos? And Shmuel says, Amar Kra mechalel mos yumos. And the mos yumos, the double language, is a ribui to teach us that a Torah ribsa mitzos harbe al chilul echad. So the Gemara immediately asks, what do you mean mitzvahs harbi? You can't kill a person twice. And the Gemara answers, we're not talking about Masechet, we're talking about shogeg. And in the case of shogeg, he brings a chatos, and we might think he brings one chatos, and that would cover him for all the malachas that he violated. Kamash Malan, Ribsa Torah mitzvahs harbe, that most yumas is going to teach me that he brings a chatos for each one of the malachas. And that's called an Eno Inyan Lemezid, Tneu Le'inyan Shogeg. So the Gemara says, V'tepikle mihadin afkale Rabbi Nassan. Why does Shmuel have to stretch out his arm to darshan Chiluk Malachos B'Shabbos from the pasuk Motz Yumas? Why not derive it from the same place that Rabbi Nosson derives from, namely from Lo Savaru H? And the Gemara quotes the Brisa of Rabbi Nosson. So the Gemara says the following: Rabbi Nosson Omer, quoting a Brisa. We don't have this whole Brisa here. We only have part of this Brisa. Lo Savaru H b'chol Moshe Sech Yom Shas Matam Elom Lefisha Demar Vayakel Moshe Eskol Adas B'nei Yisrael Vayomer Aleim Ela Dvarim Sheishis Yomim Teos and Malacha. So in the pasuk it says Dvarim, and we have a pasuk of Dvarim here in the case of Vayakel Ha'am Vayomer Aleim Ela Dvarim. And then we have another pasuk, Ela Dvarim. He quotes it in the bottom here. You see footnote number Lamed Aleph. It says, Mashma Trey, that Dvarim l'Rabos Echad Arish Shlosha, Ela b'Gmatcha Lamed Vav Shehem Lamed Tes. And we have this very sophisticated drasha. And from this drasha, we derive the conclusion that Shloshim V'Teisha Malachos never L'Moshe Sinai. So we're going to derive from the word Dvarim and together with the word Ela that there are 39 categories of Malacha. Yachal might think that if you violate any or all of the 39 Malachas Belamachas, you only bring one Chatas. Tamid Lo Malo Savaru H. Avar B'chlal Hoisa, V'Lo Yatza, Slahak Shelev Lo Melcha Ma'avara, Shechayev, Shi'av Malach V'Chayov V'Nelev B'Fnei Atzma, Kol Av Malach Chayov B'Fnei Atzma. So why does Shmuel feel compelled to quote the pasuk most you must? And the Gemara answers, Savar La Kirab Yossi, Diyom Avar Lav Yotzis. So Shmuel holds that the pasuk Lo Savaru Eish, like Reb Yossi, is only Lav Yotzis. It cannot teach me, therefore, Lechalik Yotzis. It's not a malach at all. It's only a lav. So Marshal asks the following question. It's clear from the Gemara in Masechet Shabbos that Havara was set up as a separate lav, according to Rabbi Nosson, to teach us Chiluk Malachos. And Rashi here in Masechet Yevamot seems to indicate that the reason why the Torah separated and explicitly mentioned the Isser of Havara Shabbos is to teach you that Havara is a chiyuv skila, chiyuv kares, it's a malacha. Ukvar Omer HaMizrachi al V'tzinu Achronim L'divrei HaTosos Sham Shegirsu Sham Ki Girsas HaMachilta Lo Savaru Eish Lama Nemar L'fi Shenemar Vayakel Moshe Dvarim HaDvarim Eila Dvarim Shomei Anish Lo Yechayev Al Ad Sheyavar Lamites Malachos Hamid Lo Lo Saviru Eish B'chol Moshe Sech Yom Shabbos or B'chlal also the food. So according to this Girsa, the Maram points out, here we're going to turn to page Nun if you have it, the Ikar Alimud L'chilik Malachas Chatos Eina Me'avor Ela Me'aminyan Shenilmad Me'ela Dvarim. Ela Dvarim teaches me the number of 39. And Havara is teaching us that there's a chiyuv on one single malach. You don't have to violate all 39 malachas in order to be chayav. So now we have two limudim. We have one limit from Eila Dvarim to teach us that you're chayav for each malacha. And that means that if you violated the shogeg, many malachos, you only bring one chatos. From Havara, which is a different source, we're going to derive the conclusion that you're chayav for each malacha. Uchavayu tzricha, we need both limud. Why is that? Lule Havara, Omer Sham Minyan, Eino Bala Chilik Chatos, El Lamed, She'ein tzarich b'chol lamites malachos yachad kedei l'chayva. If not for the pasuk of Havara, we would have said, okay, there's a minyan of 39 malachos, but all 39 form one entity of Chil Shabbos, and you can only violate the Shabbos and be chayav if you violate all 39 malachos. So the Torah had to take one malacha out of the bag to teach me that you're chayav for each malacha. Achli achar shalamadu. Now that Havara teaches me that you shouldn't think you have to violate all 39, now I want to know what happens if I do violate all 39. How do I know that I bring one chatas for all 39? Or shall I bring one chatas for each malacha? Because we initially started with the assumption you have to violate all 39 to be chayiv. Now we said you're chayiv for any one of them. But any one of them as representative of the other 39. It's all one entity of Chilul, Shabbos, and Malach. In came the Hechrech, Baal Limud. Now we have to know what are we deriving from the fact that Torah spells out 39. Why is that number important to me? After all, I'm chayiv even for one malach, and that we derive from Avara. So what's the significance of mentioning the number 39? The limud, this drasha that tells me there are 39 malachas, is telling me the maximum number of chatos that I could be chayiv for any violation of Shabbos. And the maximum number is going to be 39. And that means that if I violate all 39 malachas with one helen on Shabbos, I'm going to be chayiv 39 separate malachas. If not for the Avara, I would think I have to violate all 39 to be B'chal Shabbos and to be chayiv. Now that we know that you chayiv for each malacha, why does the Torah have to tell me the number, 39? What's the magic significance of the number? And that tells me the maximum number of chatos you can be chayiv on any particular Shabbos. You can never be chayiv more than 39. Why am I chayiv 39? And the answer is because of chiluk malachos. It's not the way we thought that there are 39 different ways of violating one single isur, but rather each malacha sets itself up as an isur b'fnei atzma, as an independent isur. Okay, yesterday we started going through the Gemara on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. And this sugya was focused on how do we understand Rabbi Yishmael? Do we understand that he's basing himself on a Kal Vachomer? Is he basing himself on a premise that Esei Dochalosa said? What exactly is the mechanism by which he's working? So if you remember, in the Brisa, he had the logic or the terminology called O Eno. And in the context of O Eno, Rabbi Yishmael was vacillating back and forth. And in the language of Rabbi Yishmael, if it says in the parsha of Rotseach that there's a mitzvah saseh called Mos Yumas, I'm sorry, there's a mitzvah saseh of Vehumas, we'll quote the pasuk correctly, Vehumas. So the question is, that mitzvah Vehumas, would it override the Shabbos? And in the Havamina of Rabbi Yishmael, it would in fact override the Shabbos. The question is why? And the maskana was that Mechaleh Mos Yumas is telling me that you will be in violation of Shabbos if you do any of the malachas other than Misas Bez. And at that point, in the development of his logic, Rabbi Yishmael thought that since the pasuk says Vehumas, it's telling you bein b'chol bein b'Shabbos, that you will, someone who is condemned to death, you will take him out to die even on Shabbos, even if it means overriding the Shabbos. Now Rabbi Yishmael starts with O Eno, and he has two O Enos. In the first O Eno, he says no. The mitzvah of Vehumas would not override the Shabbos. In the second O Eno, he says no, the mitzvah of Vehumas would override the Shabbos, and therefore I need the pasuk B'chaleh Mos Yumas to tell me that Vehumas does not override the Shabbos. So basically, Rabbi Yishmael is vacillating back and forth. As a result of this ambiguity, the Brisa says that we need a drasha of lo savaro h bechol mochbo secha, And the extra words b'chol moshvosechem will associate it with the words b'chol moshvosechem that appear in the Chiyuv Misas Bezdin parsha for someone who murdered someone. And there again, the Torah says, "V'aya ela lachem l'chukas mitzvah l'dortzechem b'chol moshvosechem." And b'chol moshvosechem means that we're talking about Bezdin that's putting a condemned criminal to death. And therefore, when we go back to the pasuk Lo Savaru Eish B'chol Moshvosechem, once again, B'chol Moshvosechem is referring to a criminal like a Bas Kohen Shezinsa, and she's going to be put to death with Sreifa. And the Torah is saying Lo Savaru Eish B'chol Moshvosechem Yom HaShabbos, that the chiyuv of a humas to put to death a person who's condemned to death does not override Shabbos. Now again, according to Rabbi Nosson and Rabbi Yossi that we mentioned earlier, we need the pasuk Lo Savaru Eish B'chol Eish. But the end of the pasuk B'chol Moshvosechem, that's superfluous, and that's going to give us this Zeret Shavah to B'chol Moshvosechem in the case of implementing the death penalty for a murderer. And now we plug it back into the pasuk Lo Savaru Eish, and B'chol Moshvosechem is telling me that even someone who is condemned to death by Sreifa, we will not implement Sreifa on Shabbos, because Lo Savaru Eish B'chol Moshvosechem means even in Bezdin, when Bezdin is implementing the mitzvah of Humas. Now, we pointed out that even according to Rabbi Yossi, who holds Havara L'Lav Yatzis, we still need a pasuk to determine whether or not we can implement the death penalty of Sreifa on Shabbos. Why? Where's the violation of Shabbos? And the answer is, if not Meleches Havara, because Rabbi Yossi took Havara out of the bag, Meleches Bishul. Okay. Now, until this point in the sugya, when we're about to start Daf Zayin, the assumption is that Rabbi Yishmael is operating within the framework of Esei Dochalosa. And he holds that Esei Dochalosa applies even to override the Shabbos, which is an Iser Karetz. Hence, even in Yibu Be'ochos Ishto, we would have a Havamina that it should override a Chiyuv Karetz. So the final kamashmalam of B'chol Moshvosechem is that despite the essay of a humas, we will not override Shabbos, because Lo Savaru Eish B'chol Moshvosechem even in Bezdin. But the Havamin is so important for us because in the Havamin we would have applied the principle of essay Dochalosa even in a Lotas Sheyeshbo Karetz. And what we're going to have to come to grips with, which I hope we'll get to in a few minutes, is why do you assume that we can derive conclusions from the Havamina? Why not derive the opposite conclusion from the Maskana? Because the bottom line is that we don't override the Shabbos for Misas Reifa because of Lo Savaru Eish B'chol Moshvosechem. So maybe that should teach us that Ein Esei Dochalosa Sheyeshbo Karetz. Why do you put all your eggs into the Havamina? That if not for this pasuk, we would have said that Sreifas Bezdin would override the Shabbos and Esei Dochalosa Sheyeshbo Karetz. Anyway, that's where we're holding now. Comes along Rav Shimi Bar Ashi as we enter into Daf Zayin with a whole new approach to Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael is not based on Esei Dochalosa, but rather on a Kal V'chomer. Now we're going to have to go through the Enos in the Bryce of Rabbi Yishmael and how he was vacillating within the context of this Kal V'chomer. So what's the Kal V'chomer? The Kal V'chomer sets up a hierarchy. Shabbos is on the bottom of the list. Next on the list, going up in severity, is Avoda, because the Avoda's Karbonos HaTzibur override the Shabbos. So obviously, avoda is more important, if you will, than Shabbos. It's docha Shabbos. Now, what happens in a case where you've condemned a person as a murderer, and he's a Kohen, and he has to be put to death? He is busy with the avoda. What do we do now? Should we let him do the avoda? I mean, avoda is very important. It overrides the Shabbos. Or should we say, no, we have a mitzvah now of the humas, and we have to put him to death, even if it means we'll have to waive and forfeit the avoda, we'll do so for the sake of the humas. And the halacha is that the pasuk says, "Me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamus," that if a person was condemned to death as a murderer, then he runs to the mizbeach and he wants to do the avoda because he's a kohen, and we desperately need him to do the avoda, we pull him away from the mizbeach and we take him to be killed. So we see that the mitzvah of a humas, despite its significance, will override the avoda. What do I mean? We're going to terminate the avoda for the sake of a humas. Me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamus, in the Pasha Rotzeh. Now, if the humas is so important that we'll forfeit the avoda for the sake of a humas, then kal v'chomer, we will forfeit Shabbos for the sake of a humas. And the reason for that is because avoda is more chomer than Shabbos, but humas is greater than avoda, and it overrides the avoda being mizbechi. Then how much more so should it override Shabbos, which is less chomer than avoda, because avoda sakarbonos overrides the Shabbos. So then, according to Rav Shimi, the entire thrust of Rabbi Yishmael's brisa has nothing to do with Esei Docha Losas. It has to do with the fact that we would have supposed that Vahumas is a greater mitzvah than Shabbos. So when I have to weigh these two mitzvahs on the scale, I tip the scale in favor of Vahumas, again in the Havmina before the Pasuk Lo Savaru, and I violate the Shabbos for the sake of Vahumas, because Vahumas, he says, Bezdin is more severe and more important than Shabbos. Okay, now we're up to the Eno, O Eno. Okay. And now we introduce Kvuras Mes Mitzvah into the equation. And we're going to prove now that Shabbos is more chamur than avoda, because the entire Kal V'chomer of Rabbi Yishmael is predicated on the assumption that avoda is greater, is higher on the scale than Shabbos. And why do I prove that? Because avoda is docha Shabbos. Once I prove that if Vahumas, based on the pasuk Mizbechi, overrides avoda, then certainly would override the Shabbos. Unless with the Pirch I can prove to you that Shabbos is greater than avoda. And that's where Kvuras Mes Mitzvah is going to step into the arena. Because Kvuras Mes Mitzvah, although it overrides avoda, it does not override the Shabbos. We will not bury a person on Shabbos, even if it's a mitzvah situation. That, in the language of the Gemara, is Kvuras Mitzvah Tochiach, she doches avoda, v'eno doche es hashabbos. So we're going to prove that if a Kohen is on his way to do the avoda and he encounters a mes mitzvah, he will take a break, even if there's no other Kohen to do the avoda, and he will bury the mes mitzvah. And yet, mes mitzvah, the same mes mitzvah, does not override the Shabbos. We will not bury the dead on Shabbos, even in a case of mes mitzvah. And that basically blows the Kal V'chomer of Rabbi Yishmael out of the water. So that's the first O Eno. And again, keep in mind that this O Eno, now as we're interpreting it now, is so radically different than the first interpretation of the O Eno. Because in the first interpretation of the O Eno, we wanted to suggest that we will not apply esse dochalosase in a case of a lotas hashesh bokar. That has no bearing on the Eno of the O Eno here in the second interpretation in light of Rav Shimi, because here the O Eno is presenting a pircha on the Kalmachol based on Kfurus Hames. So where are we up to here? Now let's open up to Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. And we're up to the second O Eno, which is, where it is, Hadar Omar, should be about 5 lines down from the top. Oh, here it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 lines down from the top. Hadar Omar. Now this is the O Eno El Afilu B'Shabbos. That was the second O Eno, which pushes for the fact that we will implement the death penalty and violate the Shabbos. Hadar Omar, Kvuras Mes Mitzvah Tidche Shabbos Mikal V'Chomer. You're assuming in the first O Eno that Kvuras HaMes does not override the Shabbos. We will not bury the mess, even in the case of a mes mitzvah on Shabbos. Hence, you have a pircha on the Kal V'Chomer, because if Kvuras Mes does not override Avoda, if Kvuras Mes overrides Avoda, but it does not override Shabbos, hence Shabbos is more chomer than Avoda. Now the Gemara is saying no. We're going to use the same logic of the Kal V'Chomer of Israel to derive the conclusion that Kvuras HaMes will override the Shabbos. Because if Kvuras Mes overrides Avoda, how much more so will it override the Shabbos, which is Kal, relative to Avoda? And that's called O Eno Afilu B'Shabbos. Means that if Misas Bezdin overrides Avoda, then how much more so would it override the Shabbos? We're bringing back the Kal V'Chomer, and we're throwing out the Pircha, because Af Kfuras Mes Mitzvah, Idches Shabbos, Mikal V'Chomer. Uma Avoda, which is more Chomer, that it overrides the Shabbos, Dochas Shabbos, is Kfuras Mes Mitzvah, which is more Chomer than Avoda, and Dochosa, and that's going to be derived from the Vilachoso. We'll get back to that in a minute. Shabbos, which is Kala, is Enodin Sheni Dochem Mipnei Avoda, which means Mipnei Kfuras Mes, which means Enodin Shetei Kfuras Mes Dochos. So we are now holding in the Kal V'Chomer. Rav Shimi is now very satisfied with his interpretation, Rabbi Shmuel Nebraisa. And the reason I need Lo Savaro Eish B'Chomo Shel Seichem, what was the Havamina that we would override the Shabbos for the sake of Mises Bezdin? It's based on a Kal V'Chomer, that if Mises Bezdin overrides Avoda, how much more so will it override the Shabbos, because Avoda is greater than Shabbos. You'll ask me the O Eno of Kvuras HaMes, like Kvuras HaMes should be a pircha on the Kal V'Chomer, because Kvuras HaMes does not override the Shabbos, but it does override Avoda. And the answer is that's not true. Kvuras HaMes will override the Shabbos, because why? If it overrides the Avoda, which is more chomer than Shabbos, how much more so should it override the Shabbos? Talmud Lomar Lo Sevaru Eish B'Chomosh V'Seichem. He says Bezdin does not override the Shabbos. And that's derived from B'Chomosh V'Seichem, as we discussed. And Af She'ein Mes Mitzvah Doches HaShabbos. If Misas Bezdin is not Doches Shabbos, then Mes Mitzvah is not Doches Shabbos, meaning the burial of a Mes Mitzvah doesn't override the Shabbos. Why? Because if you want to derive the conclusion that Kvuras Mes Mitzvah would override the Shabbos based on the Kal V'chomer, now we have a Pircha on the Kal V'chomer, because Misas Bezdin Tochiach, because Misas Bezdin is Doch Avoda, but it doesn't override the Shabbos. And that we derive from the Chomosh V'Seichem. So we have two approaches to the Bryce of Rabbi Yishmael and to the Havamina that Mitzas Bezdin would override the Shabbos. Either be based on Esei Docha Los Aseh, because Vahumas is a mitzvah, or it's based on a Kal V'chomer. And the underlying premise of that Kal V'chomer is that Avodah is more chomer than Shabbos. And that we learned from the fact, Me'im Mizbechi. And now we have a Kal V'chomer that certainly Misas Bezdin would certainly override the Shabbos because it overrides Avodah, which is more chomer than the Shabbos. And for that, I need the pasuk Chomosh V'Seichem. So now the Gemara says the following: the original interpretation of Rabbi Yishmael was that we needed the Chomosh V'Seichem to exclude the Asi Esei B'Dachi Los Aseh, even if it's a Los Sheish Bo Kares. So now the Torah needed to exclude Misas Bezdin on Shabbos. Is my O Eno Dika Omar. Again, if we're operating with Esei Docha Los Aseh, so what was the Halamina that the essay of the Humas of Misas Bezdin would not override the Shabbos? Why not apply Esei Docha Los Aseh? You're now holding that the entire thrust of Rabbi Yishmael is built on Esei Docha Los Aseh. So why did Rabbi Yishmael backtrack? All of a sudden, he's very inhibited about his Kal V'chomer, and he says, "Oh, Eno." What was bothering him? Hachikon. So let's go back to the basics. We have a pasuk that says Kiya be'ish chet mishpan maves v'humas, and there's a mitzvah say to implement a condemnation, a capital punishment after the criminal was condemned. Okay, so therefore that should apply even on Shabbos because we're holding now Esei Docha Los Aseh. And Mechalel Mosimus applies to other malachas with the exception of Misas Bezdin. But when the Torah commands Bezdin to carry out Misa, then we'll apply the principle of Asi Ese, V'dochi Losas. So why does Rabbi Shmuel backtrack? Why is he pulling back? What's the svara not to apply the principle of Ese Dochalos? And we're going to have to say because Shabbos is more chum. Is Hadar Omar, Amar, di Amrinon, di Osi, Ese Dochalosase. That's a losase greda. Losase sheish bo kares. Mishamet le the dochi. We have no source and therefore no justification to assume that an essay has the power to override a losase sheish bo kares. We never heard that there is such a thing. Hadar Omar, Otu Asei Doches Losase. He's asking now, why is it that an Asei is Docha Losase? Lav Losase Chomer Mine. Wouldn't we certainly assume that a Losase is more severe than and weighs more heavily on the scale than an essay? Because you get punished for violating a Losase. You get malchus. If you violate an essay, there's no malchus. And nevertheless, ka'asi essay v'dachi losase. So the Torah is now telling me that there's something very powerful, very profound, if you will, that weighs heavily about an essay. Because logically, intuitively, we would have said an essay cannot override a losase. The Gemara throws, this is the bomb. The Gemara says, Mali Chumra Zuta, Mali Chumra Rava. We should not differentiate between one lotas and another lotas. So there's no hierarchy with regard to a lotas. Once you've proven to me that an essay is greater than a losas, an essay dochalosa, we're not going to start differentiating and setting up an entire hierarchy of different losasses. This one is more chamor, it generates a chiv kares. This one is less chamor, it's maximum malchus. We're going to group together all lavim under one unified concept called the lotas. And if I can prove to you that an essay overrides any lotas in that generic, all-encompassing category of a lotas, then mali zutra, mali chumer. It doesn't matter whether it's a severe lotas or a relatively lightweight lotas, meaning a classic lotas. So now we have the Pasuk Sivaru to teach me that an essay does not override a lotas. Now, again, is this an exception to the rule? And the rule is that essay normally would override a lotas, even though it has a kares, or should we derive from this Pasuk that an essay is not powerful enough to override a lotas sheish bo kares? So at this point, where are we holding as far as Achos Isho and Yib? What's the final maskana? He says here, in the name of the Ritva, Lo ba hakasav el lahotzi mideak halachomer me'avoda. That we go back to Rav Shimi, that the entire Brisa of Rabbi Shmuel and the need for the possible Savaro Eish to prohibit Misas Bezin on Shabbos is all based on a Kal V'chomer from Avoda. And the premise is, again, as we said over and over again, that Avoda is more Chomer than Shabbos, and yet Misas Bezin overrides Avoda. Therefore, I would have thought that it should override Shabbos with a Kal V'chomer. And we don't accept the Pircha from Kvura because now we're going to say Kol Ze'achnis L'Kal V'chomer, and Ein Afkinami, there's a Havmina here that even Kvuras Mesmitzvah would override the Shabbos. And therefore, in that light, we have no conclusions to draw about Esei Dochalosa. So we're not working within the framework of Esei Dochalosa. We're working simply with a Kal V'chomer. So at this point, in the light of Rav Shimi's reinterpretation of the Brisa of Rabbi Shmuel, we have no source that would justify the need for the pasuk achoso allow in the case of achos ishta. What I don't understand is why are we necessarily accepting Rav Shimi? Is there any indication in the Gemara that Rav Shimi proved that that's the pshat of the Bryce? So I think what's happening here is the Gemara saying that I don't have a proof from this price based on Rav Shimi. Is Rav Shimi's interpretation the only what do we say, acting talent? I don't know. It could be that the original interpretation that we had operating within the framework of Esei Dochlos is correct. We never found a compelling reason to reject it. Even Rav Shimi didn't bother asking a kasha and proving his shita, his interpretation. What the Gemara is concluding is that you don't know one way or the other what Rabbi Shmuel was motivated by. Was he motivated by Esei Dochalosa, or perhaps by a Kal V'chomer? So in the light of the possibility that Rav Shimi's interpretation of Rabbi Shmuel is correct, we're motivated to look for another Havamina, another source for a premise that Yibum would apply even in the case of Achos Ishta. And we want to find a logic which is not predicated on Esei Dochalotza, because this is a lot that's the Sheish Bokaris. Achos Ishta is up there. And here's where the Gemara is at this juncture. We mentioned it in the past, where we introduce Eishes that in Yibum the Torah already overrides the Erev of Eishes which is a Chiv Kares. So it makes sense that if the Torah is so eager to implement Yibum that it looks aside on the Erev of Eishes it would also look aside on the Erev of Achos Ishta. That's where that's previews of what's coming down the line. Okay. So now let's go back to Daf Vav Amid Beis. And we want to look at Tosus Dibra Maschil O Ena, the third Tosus on the page. So now we're holding in the Gemara that there's a Havamina that Misas Bezdin would override the Shabbos. And that is the second O'Eno. Let me just double check. O'Eno Ella Afilu B'Shabbos. Correct? So in the Gemara, we're now holding with the Svara that yes, essay, in the case of Misas Bezdin, would override even a Lotas Hashesh Bokaris, namely Shabbos. And again, when we were learning this Gemara on Daf Vav base, we had no clue as to what Rabbi Shmuel was wavering about. Now we know what he was wavering about. He was wondering whether an essay could override a lotas hashesh bo kares. And at one point in the first O'Eno, he said that that's impossible. There is no such havamina that an essay could override a lotas hashesh bo kares. And then in the second O'Eno, came to the conclusion, Mali, what's the language of Gemara again? Mali, Chumra Zutra, Mali, Chumra Rab. So the first O'Eno is that we never had a Havamina, we never heard from any source that an essay could override a Lav Sheish Bokaris. And then Rabbi Shmuel backtracks and he says, what do you mean? Mali Chumra, Mali Zutra. Well, once you're overriding an essay, once the essay has the power to override the Los Essay, then it applies even to a Los Echom. And as we discussed earlier, there's a category called Lotas that includes many different strata. Tosfos says, "Oh, Eino Ela Filu B'Shabbos Mishum Mali Chumer Rabba Mali Chumer Zutra." Excuse me, Hiksha Harav Yehuda Cohen. I never heard of him. The Hecha Boili Ukme Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi the Omar Havar Laviotis. V'havi Perik Hamid Shabbos Amrinu the Rabbi Yishmael Kara Vehita. The Omer Sheyibone Beis Havikdash Avichat Shmeina Alma Davar Yesh Karetz. Asks the following question: how does the Gemara try to reconcile Rabbi Yishmael in this brisa with Rabbi Yossi, who maintains that Avara Lelav Yotzis? Rabbi Yishmael himself once was reading on Shabbos, and he was too close to the lamp, and inadvertently, when he saw that the light was not shining well, he tipped over the lamp, and he violated Havara. Then he writes down in his Pinchas a note to himself that I have to bring a Karma Chatos. Now, the premise that you have to bring a Karma Chatos for violating Havara on Shabbos could only make sense according to Rabbi Nosson. It cannot be reconciled with Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi holds the Chalik, Lelav Yotzis, which means that there's no malacha in Avara, and there would therefore not be a Chiyuv Chatos. So Rabbi Shmuel, by the fact that he wrote down in his ledger that he's obligated to bring a korban chatas, obviously he felt that Havara is a malach, which means that he reflects the sheet of Rabbi Nassan against Rabbi Yosef. The Od Kasha, another kaf. Nehi Nami Rabbi Yossi, the Gemara says that you can work this price out even according to Rabbi Yossi. And that is because in Sreifas, Mises Bezdin, there's not only Havara, but there's also Bishul. The Komakom, we see Ilav below Kra, meaning without the posig of Lo Sevaru. Avamina, the Mises Bezdin Nami, Dachya Shabbos. Why? Mishum Damrina, we say Mali Chumer Rabba, Mali Chumer Zutra. Al Gav, the Netilas Neshama Av Malachahi. Again, even if Rabbi Yossi holds that Avar is not an Av Malacha, but nevertheless, by killing the condemned, you're violating the Malach of Netilas Neshama. So we're going to have to apply the principle of Mali Chumra Zutra, Mali Chumra Rabbah. In Cain, so what bothers Tosas now? He Kasav Lo Sivaru. What is the maskana? What do we derive from Lo Sivaru? Which means that Shabbos is an Avera Chamura, and we don't override the Shabbos for such a severe violation. And we don't say Mali Chumra Rabba Mali Chumra Zutra. The Torah is teaching us that svara is unacceptable. It's Rechnami Kra Dioleh Bachos Isha the Leka Skila. Lo Nema Mali Chumra. And what's the second kasha Tosaf? Torah says Lo Savaru. And we're going to differentiate between one lav and another lav. We're going to straticize lav, if there is such a word in English. Also says, and at that point, if we reject the svara of Mali Chumra Zutra, Mali Chumra Rabba, then we're back to square one. We don't have any justification for Oleha in the case of Yibum Bachos Ishta. So Tosa says, I still need Oleha. Why? Because there's no Chiyuv Skila. In other words, now you're telling me that Lo Savaru is teaching me that we do straticize, Lavin. And if that be the case, then you're excluding Esei Dochalosa in the case of Shabbos, because Shabbos is the ultimate. It's a Chiv Skila, it's a capital crime. But how do I know that Esei Dochalosa doesn't have the power to override a override a Lav Sheish Bo Kares, but doesn't have Skila? Because that's somewhere in the middle. And when the Pasuk is excluding Esei Dochalosa under Lo Tzivaru, that's a case of Shabbos, which is so chomer that it generates a chiyuv skila. But in the case of achos ishto, which is lower than skila, it's at a level of kares, then perhaps essay would be dochalos. And hence I justify the need for the word olel. Why does the Gemara come to a conclusion that we reject Mali Chumra Zutra, Mali Chumra Rabba, Mali Chumra Zutra, and therefore there's no Havamina? Well, goes back to the drawing board. What was the Havamina before Olela? Tosa says, I don't get it. There still is a Havamina without Olela. Even if you reject Chumra Rabba, that's the Chumra Rabba of a Chiv Skila in the case of Shabbos, but not the Chumra Rabba of a Chiv Kares in the case of Achos Ishto. And all Tosas could answer is Yeshlomer and Dibalav Hachi Orach Shapir Tfed. These questions are very good questions, but the Gemara has better questions. So what I want to end today's discussion with is an introduction to the next post, is Dira Maskel Taima. Because that, I think, is the most fundamental kasha in this whole sugi that sort of like blows it out of the water. Second. Taima de Kosav Rachmona Lo Sevar Holav Hachi Dachi. So the Gemara wants to use this Bryce of Rabbi Shmuel to prove that Esei Dochalosa Sheish Bo Kares, hence we need a Lea in Achos Ish. So Tosfos says, "B'samuch muchach de lo boy lemeimar hashta mide itzrich lo sevaru lesar michlal de bialma dochi," meaning dochi esei lo seshesh bo kares. So he's now invoking the sugya of Zion that we learned today. And he says that at this point, we're not going to say that we need Lo Tzivaru to prohibit Sreifas Baskoy Michal to be Alma Dochi Esei. Because the Gemara is going to say that if not for Lo Tzivaru, we would have said that the mitzvah of Sreifas Baskoy should be Docha the Los of Shabbos, Kimo Belav de Kalayim B'tzitzis, and we would apply the svara of Mali Chumer Rabba, Mali Chumer Zutra. So that's where the Gemara is going to say that we need the lav of Lo Savaru to teach me that we don't apply Esei Dochalosa said with the svara of Mali Chumra Rabba, Mali Chumra Zutra. So if that be the case, then Itzrich lo Sevaru legufe. The Imtomar de legufe Itzrich is Adarabba Nelef Mihacha de lo dochi, that an essay cannot be docha lav if the lav is a lav sheish bo kares. The lo amrinan mali chumra rabba mali chumra. The whole havamin and the need for lo savaru was based on mali chumra rabba mali chumra zutra. Now that the Torah taught me on the lo savaru that we will not override the Shabbos for the sake of misas sreifa for that essay, then let's derive from here that we don't apply the principle of mali chumra rabba mali chumra zutra. But on the contrary, we differentiate between the level of chumrah, and in the case of Shabbos, the level of chumrah is that of a chiyuv kares, and therefore we don't override a chiyuv kares for the sake of the essay, in this case of misas reifa, and then we're stuck again with the following: if we derive from here, from lo sevaru eish b'chomash sechem, the conclusion that essay that ain't essay dochalos sheish bo kares, then we don't understand how to justify the pasuk of Aleh in the case of Achos Ishta. Okay, then, so let's make a note of where we got up to. Up to Otsus Dibra Maskil Taima in the first of the wide lines. Okay, then, so that's where we'll stop.